Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to have you here and see you here. And I see a number of familiar faces, so I want to thank you especially for coming back for more. And tonight's presentation is on magic and the occult. And these are subjects that confuse and frighten lots of people. In fact, they're often associated with Satanism, which we'll talk about a little bit as well. What about witchcraft? What about esotericism, mysticism? What do all these things mean? I'm going to start by just saying, kind of briefly, what these things are, or how I'm going to define them for the purposes of this talk. By the way, as usual, I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes, and there'll be at least a half hour afterwards. So if you have any questions or comments, if you could hold them till then, that would be great. There was one of the most influential thinkers of the 20th century was a man named Ferdinand Associa. Saussure was a linguistics professor. He never wrote anything, but he wrote one of the most influential books of the 20th century. How did he do that? Well, he gave this linguistics course, and it was so good that when he died, a couple of his students got together, took their notes, got together Saussure's notes from his wife, and created a course in general linguistics, which is very, very widely read and very, very widely admired. Now, Saussure said a lot of brilliant things, but probably the most brilliant thing he said is the one that, despite his reputation, has gone almost unnoticed. And that is, when you define something, start with a thing, not with a word. Defining words upon words upon words upon words is a fascinating academic exercise up to a point. But it would be helpful to realize that maybe we're actually dealing with things and phenomena here. And no two things are alike, right? So with all of these things, we're taking like a basket of things and we're calling them the same thing just so we can talk and think about them. So I'm going to start with the simplest, which is the mystic. And the mystic, exemplified by people like John of the Cross, the author of The Cloud of Unknowing in the 14th century, is interested in one thing. He's interested in reaching God as soon and as directly as possible. Anything else is an obscurity. The Cloud of Unknowing is about this. The Cloud of Unknowing, which is a very short treatise written by someone whose name we do not know, said there's this cloud of darkness which is unknowing, or probably in contemporary English, oblivion would be the best word, or obliviousness between you and God. So you, through your mystical practice, strike at the cloud of unknowing, using a word like God or love. That is what the mystic is interested in. Nothing else. Nothing else matters. We could also talk about the esotericist and esotericism. And let's say the esotericist wants to do the same thing. But it turns out that the path isn't always that direct or that clear or that easily trodden. There are way stations on the way. You know that verse in the Bible where it says, "In my house there are many mansions"? Well, the word literally means way stations. And the esotericist is interested at least in seeing some of the scenery along the way. These are different levels of reality. They're characterized by different types of experience, different states of being, encounters with different beings. And these have been described elaborately in many different texts, which are many different traditions, which all, of course, are different, but as often happens, at least in my experience, the similarities among these are much more compelling than the differences. The Kabbalah is one example. Saint Teresa of Avila is considered to be a mystic in the way I just described, but she wrote a book called Interior Castle, in which she's talking about this literally interior castle with deeper and deeper levels of spiritual penetration. So by the term I'm using, she's an esotericist. Now, all right, so you either want to get to God directly and not bother about anything else. That's the mystic. You want to at least see what's going on in between, because it might be of some interest. And anyway, you might not get to God exactly right away, because sometimes it takes a while. And then there's the occultist. And I'll define the occultist as someone who wants to use and interact with some of the forces and some of the things he learns along the way in order, well, to see what they're like, to do things with good or bad motives. That is the term I'm going to use, and those are the way I'm going to use those terms today. Now, the minute I said that, I have to add that this is not the way the terms are often used. I'm going to focus on the occult because, hey, that's what the subject is. But you'll see the occult is what? It's like Ouija boards, it's pentagrams, it's, you know, the typical concept of the occult is some kind of like scowling Satanist in a black robe, or some ditzy teenage girls in a Hollywood movie who do some kind of Wicca ritual and, oh my God, it works, you know, and then the house starts tipping over and the, knives are flying across the kitchen and stuff like that. And that's what is often equated with the occult, thanks to pop culture, tarot cards. Obviously, the tarot is a very long and intricate subject, and I've given a talk on that, which you can watch on YouTube. So I'm not going to talk about it here. But the occult, let us say, is the sphere of the magician. The magician or occultist, we can think of those terms as synonyms for tonight, wants to do something with all of these forces that are unseen, yet somehow have an impact on the world we see. And this kind of practice is universal. It is everywhere. It is done everywhere in all cultures, including, surprising to say, our own. Given that this is spread so widely, there has to be something in it. Often, like with primitive tribes, this kind of knowledge is considered to be the most important knowledge they have. And they go through elaborate rites and rituals to transmit this knowledge to the worthy of the younger generation, so it won't be lost. All the other knowledge is incidental. We're the opposite. This knowledge is worthless. It's all rubbish. It was all disproved by Mr. Science, 200 years ago, and we need not bother with it. Except somehow we know that that is not 100% the truth. So I'll talk a little bit about magic, and I'll tell you how it works according to two theories: the old theory and the new theory. The old theory is started before anyone began to count or think about time. It works through the intermediary of spirits. These are unseen entities with whom one can theoretically interact. Some of them are nice, some of them are not so nice, but if you kind of play your cards right, you can get them to do things for you. Or you can get them to do things to other people if that is your desire. As I say, this is an extraordinarily common belief. Now, the technical term for this kind of magic is goetia, G-O-E-T-I-A, which is a Greek word for sorcery. And what does it mean? It means basically what I just told you. And a lot of these things are about conjuring up spirits. There was a famous Italian sculptor in the 16th century named Benvenuto Cellini, who wrote a very famous autobiography. And in it, he describes the time he makes contact with a Sicilian priest. And a lot of the occultists of the early modern era were priests who didn't have a lot to do or couldn't really quite get employment as priests. And the practice of magical ritual is not really all that different from the Eucharist and this and that. So it's kind of a natural kind of career fit. But anyway, he got together with a Sicilian priest and he said, well, you know, can you show me something? Yeah, I can show you this. So they got together in the Roman Colosseum. And Cellini's account of it is very weird because there's an assistant there, one or two assistants. And this is what Cellini says. Suddenly the whole place was filled with spirits. The assistant was like shaking his hand. I thought he was going to, you know, drop the candle he was supposed to be holding. It was just absolutely terrifying. Now, one thing he does not mention in this account, which would be the most interesting thing of all, is what these spirits looked like. Did they really materialize like more or less humanoid forms? Were they like smoke? Did they look like Casper the Friendly Ghost? He doesn't tell us. And I find the subject enormously interesting. And the answers you get to it are rather oblique. So this was how it worked in the old days. I mean, up to, well, still does. But in the 1850s, a Frenchman named Eliphas Lévy, actually who was he didn't quite make it to the priesthood because he decided he liked girls too much. You can see again the natural fit between priest and magus. Published a book called, well, in English is Doctrine and Ritual of High Magic. And Lévy's view of it was a little bit different than the old one. Lévy, in fact, did try to conjure up a spirit of two. I think he tried to conjure up the spirit of the Greek sage Apollonius of Tyana. But he had another angle on it too. And it's had to do with something called the astral light. Now the astral light, and those of you who are Theosophists will notice that Madame Blavatsky uses this term. Well, where did she get it from? She got it from, among other people, Eliphas Lévy. And what is the astral life? Well, it's like matter, except it's not matter. It is such stuff as dreams are made on. That is to say, well, just for a second, picture a green lion. Can you imagine a green lion, some form or another? Well, notice something. Green lions don't really exist. But there is some kind of image that you have in your mind, and you could say it is made of a kind of mind stuff. Well, let's say you're kind of the creative type. Hey, you know, I kind of like this idea of this green lion, and you happen to be good at drawing, right? So you start drawing sketches of this green lion, and you have friends in Hollywood, and suddenly you've sold a very lucrative animated series about something that doesn't even exist, as we've all admitted, as you yourself admit. So thoughts have power, and I'll get back to this point in more than one way as the subject goes on. But the magical theory is this, that you can concentrate on this image in your mind and make it real, at least to the extent that it will start to have kinds of visible effects. The most famous case of this that I know of was by a Frenchman named Alexandre David-Néel, who was unlike any other European, and certainly any other European woman, managed to get into Tibet in the early part of the 20th century. Tibet was completely closed to outsiders. And somehow she got in and she started studying with these lamas and wrote books about what she learned, and she learned through practice. And one of these things was visualization. And one of these practices was visualization of a tulpa. And a tulpa is one of these thoughts that has, shall we say, manifested in material form, or apparently material form. And the form she concentrated on was that of a Tibetan monk. And eventually this monk really started to show up, or some kind of simulacrum of this monk. And this monk started to give her problems. He was kind of a, you know, kind of a mischievous creation. It's a very common theme in magic that your creations kind of get out of whack. And I'll tell you another story or two about that before the night is done. So she had to go through the reverse process. She had to disassemble this tulpa she had created. And, you know, the work doing that was harder than the work of creating him to begin with. Now, that's an extreme case. Does that sort of thing happen in the West? Well, maybe, maybe not. Here's another story that's relevant, I think. There is a famous contemporary magus called Lon Milo Duquette. He lives in Southern California, and he's a Facebook friend of mine. He published a book called My Life with the Spirits, which tells this story. He was financially desperate, and he decided he was going to do a magical ritual to get out of this bad financial situation. And he went to this text called The Keys of Solomon the King, written, I don't know, maybe, wasn't written by Solomon, maybe written 14 or 1500, and which had all sorts of spirits you could invoke who could get them to do certain things. And he picked out this one that was a horse, or looked half the form of a horse. And he created this little mental image, and he sort of told it, you know, look, I want some results out of you in an hour. But as usual, something went wrong, and he forgot that he had this very, very, like, it was like cinnamon oil on his fingers, because you're always putting oils and rituals, and he put it in his eyes, and his eyes are like blinded, and he actually had this vision of this horse. Well, you know, he's going mad with this cinnamon oil in his eyes. Well, eventually he managed to get it out of his eyes. And sometime within an hour, this old friend of his showed up in this beat-up car whose floor had rotted out. The car was drivable, but it was no classic, let's put it that way. The guy said, you know, I'm just going to give you this car. And he took the car. Now he had a car, so he used it to get a job. And he got a job. He ended up 2 months later as manager, you know, wherever he got this job at, and on and on and on. So he actually got what he wanted at the cost of some burn to his eyes. But hey, that's not even the best part. You make up, one of these things is you make up a sigil. It's a magical symbol, kind of, you know, all sorts of shapes that represent this entity. And he had this thing, and the rule is you don't let this out of your possession, ever. Well, he decided that the best thing to do with this was to tape it inside a precious guitar of his, which of course he would never let out of his presence because he prized it too much. Unfortunately, he forgot about this. And he knew this guy who was very good at crafting guitars, and the guy said, you know, that's a beautiful guitar, it needs a little work, I'd be happy to do it for you in exchange for some music lessons. Of course, the guy found the sigil, and the guy thought, well, it's kind of interesting. When the guy delivered the guitar back, he was late, and he said, yeah, I was coming from the racetrack. And Duquette said, the racetrack? What are you doing at the racetrack? You're not interested in that stuff. You know, I went to the racetrack yesterday with my father, and these horses were so beautiful. I just wanted to love them. I just wanted to be a horse. And he became obsessively preoccupied with gambling on racing, horse racing. Remember, this entity had the shape of the horse? And the guy apparently ruined himself, you know, he just became a gambling addict, and so on, so on, so on, so on. So A, you can get these results. On the other hand, you can never quite count on not getting unwanted results. Why? Well, the old theory, these spirits do not want to serve you. You are compelling them. You were compelling them with all sorts of threats. You're hurling every name of God you've ever heard of, Hebrew, Latin, whatever, at them, and you were subduing them. So they are slaves, right? They're really not there for you. So they're going to try to get out, and they're going to try to sabotage your efforts. Arguably, this is what happened with Duquette's entity, the name of this entity is not coming to me at the moment, although it may come to me before the end of the talk. But let's look at it through the new theory. Let's say you're looking at it from the point of view of sculpting the astral light. You're making a shape in this stuff, and you're putting enough energy toward it, though it starts to have a kind of quasi-life of its own. If one person does it, might have something. The person has to have tremendous willpower. Powers of concentration. A group of people, well, starts to get really, really powerful. And yes, it can get very, very powerful, and things can get very, very weird. But if you're talking about sculpting the astral light, it's trying to sculpt nitroglycerin, which is a very sloppy, jelly-like substance that's also very explosive. And things can go wrong and do. So there are two theories about why things can go wrong. I don't know anyone who's ever had any experience with this who did not achieve some, shall we say, unanticipated and undesired results. Because you can't stipulate everything clearly enough. Here's yet another story. A woman I knew had a boyfriend who was trying to start a business. And this boyfriend needed $10,000 for his business. So she did some kind of magical ritual to get $10,000 for her boyfriend. Well, just around this time, she was finishing medical school, and she was moving out of her med school dorm, and she had her car packed with all of her things, and this car was broken into, and everything was cleaned out. What did the insurance settlement amount to? Again, it works. I mean, you can't say it didn't work, and you might be able to list off enough conditions so somehow, the usual Wiccan formula. Wicca is a form of modern paganism, which is another lecture that I'm not going to go into very much here. But they will say, "and it harmed none," and being archaic English for if it harmed none. Well, that maybe is a little bit more of a protection. But you are playing with realms that people don't really know too well, particularly in this culture. And it's bound to have some kind of, repercussions. Let me tell you a story from my own experience. When I was at, this is really true. That time I was in wizard school in England, just like Harry Potter. Except it wasn't very much like Hogwarts. We're all holed up in this old English country house, and we're training in this stuff. So at one point, you learned how to raise and direct power, which is basically the same as life force. Chinese masters get so good at it that they can throw it at you and knock you over from a distance. I think this happened to Bill Moyers in one of his documentaries. So I thought, well, all right, I had this project I wanted to do. So I would put all of this toward this when I was sitting there. And I could feel it then. I mean, it just didn't happen. It was the closest analogy I can give to it, if you don't mind my using that, is kind of like a premature ejaculation. It just sort of went, and nothing came of that project. It wasn't a particularly bad project. I mean, there was nothing, ridiculously, it just obviously wasn't the right project, and it wasn't going to happen. So there. So this is somewhat like the whole magical world. Now, you'll see a lot of symbols of one sort or another, and tools. And you can ask what purpose they have. And if you go back to the idea that they have to do with focusing your mind, your attention, your will, and your energy, the tools are used to do that. How do they do that? Well, mind power, as everyone has said before, is very, very great. But what we understand to be mind power is really not particularly great at all. As in, I think I'm going to give up coffee for a few days. Yeah, does that work too well? Not always. It will work if a much greater part of the mind is involved. And classically, there are three parts of the mind. And we can call them the mind proper, part that thinks, the emotions, and part that handles your physical body, the part of your mind that handles your vital energy, which is by far the most powerful, and by far you have the least conscious access, which is good because you would probably just mess it up anyway. If you can focus all of these, you have a much better chance of attaining some result. Now, this lower part of the mind, this physical part of the mind, the Hawaiians call it the unihi pili, which means just what I just told you, is very, very powerful. It has the mind of a 2-year-old, because this part is the mind, and it responds very strongly to sensory stimuli. It kind of only understands sensory stimuli, or understands them better than anything else. So if your action, your intention, is accompanied by a ritual, something for this part of the mind to do, it has that much force. And the more it concentrates on it, the more it has to do, the odds get so much better. And that is, in a sense, the secret not only of magic, but all ritual. All ritual is designed to appeal to this. Oh, by the way, this unihi pili is kind of like your dog in that it is very routine. It likes routines. It's very comfortable with routines, and gets into routines very easily. Does this explain why ritual suddenly often becomes incredibly automatic and mindless? Because that part of the mind is just doing it over and over again. This part disengages, and again, you have nothing. That's when ritual, like religious ritual, for example, becomes empty, and when people begin to lose interest in it. It's all mechanical. There's very little emotional or mental involvement in it. But if you can get all these three things involved, and that's what many of these things are intended to do, many of these systems and practices, you might be able to get something. Now, there is another thing that is rarely noticed or observed in this whole account. A lot of what I've said is reasonably common knowledge. But what I'm about to say is not. The mind is very powerful. The collective mind is very, very powerful. The collective mind is much, much more powerful, of course, than any individual mind. And I strongly suggest that the belief system that a culture lives in, kind of the atmosphere of belief, so to speak, greatly conditions the kind of things that can happen and do happen. This is a really bizarre thing to say, but in West Africa, if you read accounts of West Africa, people there live in a forest of spirits. There are all sorts of spirits, blamed rightly, wrongly for all sorts of things. That is their world, and in that context, it is real. We live in a very mechanized, automated, materialistic society. So we take that sort of thing a lot less seriously, so that kind of sense is much less pervasive. Nobody is strong enough, really, to totally countervail the presiding, well, sometimes it's called consensus trance. So this sometimes, I think, explains why these things are much more common in other cultures. It's not the fact that people believe in them, not only are going to make them more credulous, but in a way open more of the gates for it to happen. Whereas if you're trying to do something on this on your own here in the good old land of air conditioners and cars and whatnot, it may or may not work. You can have all sorts of motives for doing it. I have a Facebook friend who's just published a book. It's on magical rituals for social action. And he got quite a bit of attention for himself by very publicly holding a series of rituals to bind none other than the current president of the United States. Do they work or not? I don't know. But people can try this, I suppose. If we lived in a society where this belief was more pervasive, it might work quite demonstrably. There are American Indian legends of whole civilizations on this continent that were destroyed because of sorcerers who got into occult warfare with one another. I certainly think it's possible. The content of our beliefs, the things that we believe routinely, are not really very common. They are a very new phenomenon in history. And to go back not very long ago and not very far away, the world of spirits, the world of magic was much, much more real. Belief imposes a certain power. But if it's just your belief, it might not have, maybe not. But if everyone believes it, to tell you the horrible, ghastly truth, it's true. Or at least you think it is. I mean, there are a lot of small children who see spirits. What happens to them in this culture? If they're lucky, their parents say, that's nonsense, there's no such thing, and they stop seeing them. If they're not lucky, they're diagnosed as crazy and get stuffed with all sorts of medicines, and let's not get into that. But you're just told you don't see these things. They don't exist, so you stop seeing them. And you all know children are much, much more suggestible than adults are. The whole process, some have theorized about raising children and socializing them is a practice of hypnotic indoctrination, which is much more powerful than, you go to the hypnotist and he puts you under and, you will quit smoking, and it might work and it might not. But, this is an adult, in a half-hour session. We're talking about a child who's totally unformed, who's totally brought up within a given culture, and that is its reality. One might say, to adapt a certain traditional saying, it takes a village to hypnotize a child. And we are all, in a sense, living in this consensus trance in some sort of way. And one reason people go to things like events like this is that, well, maybe there's something around and maybe we should at least try to see it, even if it's rather difficult or rather vaguely imagined to us. So that context of belief, I think, is very, very important in the world of magic. Now, I can't avoid, nor should I think, avoid talking about magic and the occult without talking about Satanism, because this too has an enormous range of meanings. An Italian scholar named Massimo Introvigne wrote a 600-page history of Satanism from the 16th century to today. Actually, I reviewed it on my blog. So if you just Google Richard Smoley blog, you can read it. Fascinating book, obviously a huge number of weird stories. What is the principle of it? Well, if you pray to God for certain things and God doesn't give them to you for whatever reasons best known to himself, maybe you can go to the shop across the street. Maybe you'll get better results there. Strangely enough, Satanism in its modern form, according to Introvigne, got its start at the court of Louis XIV at Versailles. And it just seemed, according to him, it was just sort of like another fun vice that the aristocracy got into because they were sick of all their other vices and sort of caught on. But in any case, maybe you can get some help from the other side. The devil will give you power theoretically that God will not give you. This is the basis of the legend of Faust. Faust sells his soul to the devil and gets everything. In Goethe's version of Faust, it's a little different, but the classic one is he sells his soul and gets hauled off, at a certain hour of midnight. Marlowe's tragedy, Dr. Faustus, is the most famous version of that. So you bind yourself to these spirits. Bernard Shaw wrote a play called The Devil's Disciple, which is a very witty play, and it's set in Puritan New England. And there's one character who's the devil's disciple, hence the name. And he's, of course, the only likable character in the entire play. All the others are like these totally humorless, hypocritical Puritans. And, they ask this guy, why are you the devil's disciple? Well, look, if this is what God's disciples are like, I think I'll stand up for the other party. And there is, an element of that in a lot of Satanism, the idea of revolt against hypocrisy, against, the excesses of religion. In its most best-known form in America today, there was a man named Anton LaVey who started the Church of Satan in the 1966. And he really did his best to do the Hollywood, he had shaved his head and he had a sharp Van Dyke beard. And he had a house in San Francisco that was painted black. He even had a Satan mobile, which rather comically was a VW Beetle. And he wrote a book called The Satanic Bible, which was very, very influential. Where did he get his ideas from? Well, Satan, he said, is about self-satisfaction, self-fulfillment, self-realization, hell with other people. Just assert yourself in the world. Become yourself. Become a master. It sounds a little like Nietzsche. It sounds a little like Ayn Rand. And Introvigne, the man I told you about earlier, said that one of the chief influences on Anton Zandor LaVey was, in fact, Ayn Rand. So there you have Ayn Rand, the doyen of the Church of Satan on the one hand, Alan Greenspan, head of the Federal Reserve on the other, because he was also a disciple of Ayn Rand's. It's like, this is just like a paranoid theorist, just dream come true. But it is about, self-realization, self-actualization. Of course, the number of Satanists are very small. Are there other cults that will do all sorts of bad things? Probably. Because when you're dealing with a human race, you have to assume, as a rule, that if you can think of it, no matter how beautiful or how ghastly or horrifying it is, somebody's tried it. Maybe even does it regularly. I'm not even going to mention the grotesque possibilities, but yeah, they're probably out there. There's also a lot of legend. Of course, people who see kind of diabolical influence everywhere are not really to be taken seriously, unless you take a very metaphysical view of it, that the self-aggrandizing ego is the devil. The devil is the personification of the selfish, self-aggrandizing ego in all of us. In that case, yeah, he's pretty much everywhere. He's pretty much at the wheel. I need not cite examples. So anyway, that's a little bit about it. It's there's certainly a lot of nonsense about it. Satanism does not necessarily have to do with magic or the occult. It's sort of, shall we say, a small subsection of it. People will say the pentagram is a symbol of evil. What does the pentagram mean? Well, in its basic form, the pentagram means this, right? It stands for the embodied human. And as such, there's nothing evil in it. There are pentagrams inscribed on the floors of medieval churches. How did it become a symbol of evil? Well, sometimes the inverted pentagram can be associated with, shall we say, malevolent forces. Why? Well, it's an inversion of that, which means, in a practical sense, this is not doing your thinking for you, this is. That tells you a lot, doesn't it? So that, and the whole question is, can you do magic in an ethically responsible way? Now, here's the line. Black magic, certainly includes things done for malevolent ends, like trying to put a death curse on someone, or trying to get someone to fall in love with you who doesn't really, isn't too interested in it. Yeah, that's going to work out really well. So it's magic with a selfish or malevolent motive. And white magic, by this description, is magic performed with selfless, higher, pure motives. Okay? And I believe it's said, by some of the early Theosophists, you should only attempt to perform magic if your motives are completely pure. Well, nobody's motives are completely pure. Absolutely zero. Mine, not yours, not anybody's. There's a little bit of the dark side in all of us. I really hope that you did not hear this for the first time tonight. In fact, if you think your motives are completely pure, totally disinterested, you're really above it, that's when you're really screwed. And that, of course, that starts to include the craziest and most dangerous people in the history of the world. So you can have pure motives, yeah. It's going to be a long time. So I think we all have to assume that there are mixed motives. I think it would be not a bad idea to avoid doing that would harm anybody or force anybody to do something against their will. In terms of doing things for oneself, I go back to that story about the car that got broken into. I mean, I'm talking about personal experience myself. Yeah, that can kind of work, but in a funny sort of way, it always backfires on you. And either you got what you wanted, and it really was kind of awful, or kind of went bad in some sort of way. It's sort of a little better to try to work in a somewhat more natural way with the will of the universe, in my opinion. So anyway, that's it. Now, does magic have anything to do? What does the kind of magic I'm talking about have to do with the kind of magic you see on stage? Obviously, there's a difference. Now, stage magic, sleight of hand magic, was originally invented to fool people into thinking that the occult magic worked. Nobody started going to see magical. They said a real occultist, and this occultist learned how to do all sorts of fantastic things, which you can see in any magic act today. And people say, wow, how did he do that? I do remain of the opinion that the line between ritual magic and sleight of hand magic is not as rigid as many people would like to think. And the reason for this goes to human to diversion and human suggestibility. Now, I don't know how to perform a single magic trick, but I know from everything I've read and everything I've ever heard from anyone who knew anything, that diversion of attention is the most important thing. You have them looking here while you're doing something here. That's how it works, theoretically. And human suggestibility is also a great part of it. Humans are very suggestible. We live in a kind of low-grade hypnotic trance, some say, just an ordinary waking life. So we can be kind of diverted. I often think about, the act of disappearing. Can you make yourself invisible? Well, the standard concept of that is that you just kind of vanish in the way, like Samantha in Bewitched. In ancient literature, like in the Aeneid of Virgil, the god covers him with a mist of invisibility. That's the way that they envisaged it. But if you really wanted to be invisible, what would be the easiest way to be invisible? Not be noticed. Because, quite frankly, most of us do not notice most of the things that are in this room at this time. This happened to me this morning. I was at the Fountain View Fitness Center. And the Fountain View Fitness Center has this televised weather screen, and the weather is always has no relation to what's actually going on. It's sunny and 70 according to this weather. Now it's 59 and raining. I mean, it's just hilarious, and it's been like this for a long time. So I told one of the clerks that, she sees this thing more than I do. Her desk is right there. She said, "Oh, I never noticed that." This weather screen is just totally irrelevant and almost contradictory to what's really going on, and she just never simply noticed it. So and people do not notice things. So all you have to do, assuming you want to be invisible, is let yourself be unnoticed, and that's probably a trick you can practice. Some people are trying to do exactly the opposite. They want to be noticed all the time, but as I think just about every celebrity has learned, that there are certain disadvantages to that little life strategy. Anyway, these are the main points I wanted to go over, and it's about time. So let me open up the floor to whatever you might have to say.
I've read that the Church of Satan, the LaVey thing, he was he's an atheist, right? They say. How do you explain, could you explain the relevance of that or how that fits into some of the theoretical ideas you had?
Well, there was he had a career for a while as a carnival barker. So there was kind of a bit of circus theatricality in the whole thing. Did he take the concept of Satan seriously? Probably not. And this led to a big split, as a matter of fact, in the Church of Satan in 1975. Because there were Satanists who think, well, there really is an entity that we would like, a supernatural entity that we identify with Satan. And they broke off and they became the Temple of Set. Identifying Set, the putatively evil god of the Egyptian pantheon, with Satan. I don't think there's any connection between those two, by the way, but they did. So no, I don't. No, it was a lot of it was kind of a charade. But his whole thing is, hey, I'm playing this game. I'm not pretending that I'm not lying to you. I'm lying to you, okay? I'm telling you that I'm lying to you, so I'm not lying to you. And if you do that entertainingly enough and with enough kind of, pizzazz, you get to be a consultant on Rosemary's Baby, for example, which he was. Anyone else? Yeah.
Sigil Magic, I was wondering what you thought of corporations using Sigil Magic on the masses, and like you said, the more people that are focused on it, it draws energy to it and creates more power. So they put it, most, I believe, corporate logos are Sigil Magic intentionally, and that's why most the main corporations stay in power. And that was one question. Also, and that keeps us in a trance. And I believe we're in a trance. Most people are sleepwalking.
Helps.
But also, as far as you didn't touch on gematria, as far Chaldean gematria or Jewish or.
I can talk about that a little bit.
What you thought of that?
Yeah. All right. Well, let me talk about sigil. A sigil is a magical symbol. They range, but in a sense, you could say most simple geometric figures can be used as sigils. They are symbols, right? Now, these symbols, the cross, the swastika, the crescent, the circle, all of these things are very, very powerful. The triangular, the thing that both the peace movement and Mercedes-Benz seem to share in common. All of these things are very powerful. They have no meaning per se, because the level of the symbolic touches a level of the mind that is beyond meaning. But you can attach meaning to it if you want to try. And the swastika is certainly the most famous example. I have an article called A Twisted History of the Swastika, which is online, which shows you how that whole thing developed, if you really want to follow that. So yes, in a sense, that's true. Now, the only part that I question, I really do not know the answer to this, is, yes, corporations put all sorts of things, to what extent is this conscious? Or whether they're doing it, in a sense, kind of unconsciously themselves, I don't know. Do they have some magus back there doing that? I don't know. I kind of doubt that. I think there's kind of more of an intuitive use of power, and everybody uses symbols, rather than kind of an intentional conspiracy-like view. That would be my personal take on it. But I'm not wedded to that point of view. All sorts of things can go on without our knowing about it. Well, gematria is adding up the number values of the letters of a word. And if the value of two different words are the same, there is some kind of either equivalence or relation or identity between them. That is the theory. This gives you some pretty funny results because, hey, guess what? The letters for the Hebrew word for snake or serpent, nahash, add up to the same value as the letters for Messiah. And some, is it some length, the snake in a secret sense, the Messiah? I mean, some have come to that conclusion, and that is the kind of conclusion you can draw from that. And plenty of people do. It is fascinating. I would say this about it. It is a useful contemplative device, but I would avoid getting locked too much into asserting, equivalences. What you're doing by this is stimulating your mind to make connections. And it's the stimulation of the mind and the connection that the mind makes within yourself, the kind of integration of the mind, that's more important than, this kind of secret code. That is my personal opinion of it. From a little bit of experience. So I think it's fascinating. I think it's interesting to contemplate. But like a lot of things in this area, if you kind of glom onto it as the truth, you're probably off course a little bit. That would be what I would say. And gematria in English is always a little bit artificial, because Gematria was invented probably by the Greeks, believe it or not. Actually, the earliest instance of Gematria is on an Assyrian carving from the 8th century BC. But, well, there's a graffito from ancient Rome, and it said, add up the letters Nero, Caesar, and killed his mother, they're the same. It was widely believed, very likely because it was true, that Nero killed his mother. But notice that if this was this was well known enough as a kind of device that some Roman juvenile delinquent could scrawl it on a wall, it must have been pretty well known. The Hebrew instances, and Hebrew also has letter number equivalents, are later. In Hebrew, of course, it's called gematria, which is, guess what, a Greek word. So the Greek, if you do it with the Greeks, it's called isopsephy, I-S-O-P-S-E-P-H-Y, if that's of any interest. So I think it's an interesting contemplative device. Proving anything with it is, sometimes it was used as a code. I mean, the most famous example is 666. 33, yeah. Well, where does that come from? It comes from the book of Revelation, where the number of the beast is 666. And when I was a kid, there was a building on Fifth Avenue in New York. It had the word 666 written on it, quite proudly. In fact, my parents took me to dinner at the roof, you know, the restaurant on the roof, top of the sixes. I don't think they can do that anymore.
Oh, they do it everywhere. I see 666 everywhere.
But I think Stofers, who had the company that had top of the sixes, maybe not quite using that motif quite the same way, although it's much more common now. But the most common theory, or the meaning of that, is that 666 in Aramaic letters is the numbers of the letters of Nero Caesar, who, by just about everyone's account, was an extremely bad man. That is the most common explanation for that. I mean, you will see many, 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 many more. So how would that work? Well, if you're a Christian writing in the first century, you don't really want to have anything down on paper saying, you know, the emperor is a murderous beast. You allude to it in that kind of way. The Jews did it very often. For example, in a lot of the Talmudic and Kabbalistic literature, it will talk about Edom, which in the Bible was the nation that descended from Jacob's big brother Esau. And all the bad things are going to happen to Edom. Well, in the time of the rabbis, there was no Edom left. That nation had vanished. It was always an allusion to Rome. And once the Roman Empire fell, it was an allusion to the Roman Church. So when they talk about Edom in a lot of medieval Jewish texts, they're talking about the Catholic Church for similar reasons. Well, we're just talking about you. We're not talking about your horribly vicious totalitarian organization.
There's a question from someone who wrote in. You've spoken quite a bit about dark magic. What about white magic, the work of the disciple? Through present-day mantras, meditation, intentions, dedication, and group work, white magic gives humanity hope. Mm-hmm.
I agree with that. I agree with that. All right. Here, if you want to do it. I really got this email on me today. Evidently, no less an entity than the Pope has asked everybody at 1 p.m. tomorrow local time to take a minute and concentrate on peace. I mean, I really got this message today. So the idea is not unlike, would he call it white magic? Probably not. But it is a form of white magic. Everybody's trying to get together to visualize something that presumably is more desirable than strife. And then the question is, will it have palpable effects? It's always very hard to see direct effects. And it is often said, if you're doing a magical ritual, have it be over and don't look for results. It is what it is. It will accomplish what it accomplishes. Similarly, if you're going to do this tomorrow, why not? All right, I did this. I meditated on peace for a minute, just the way I was supposed to, hope other people did. And then you don't go rooting around in the newspapers looking to see if, there's more peace than there was on Thursday. You know what I mean?
That leads into my question. I was curious how prayer and intention may be a big part of why magic works. Or can you just, I have used the power of intention a lot to create things in my life or manifest things. So how does that fit in with magic?
The power intention as used today is, shall we say, a more streamlined version of some of the things I'm talking about. It's the power of intention is generally seen as a mental act, although it's not accompanied by ritual practices or anything like it. It's just generally thought of as an act of mental will. So in a sense, it's the same principle, but theoretically more streamlined form. Why is that way? Because we live in a streamlined technical society, and we don't believe in all the shrouds and the wands and all that sort of thing, except in the movies. So that is, in a sense, it's the same principle. It's just updated. I mean, prayer, petitionary prayer, is, well, the most famous definition. Distinction was made by J.G. Fraser in a book called The Golden Bough, a classic study of this sort of thing. And his theory was that magic is kind of a primitive version of science. That is to say, it's operative. You do X, Y, and Z, X, Y, and then A, B, C will happen. It's operational. Fraser said, and I'm not sure he's right, that religion came when people realized that magic didn't work. So instead of trying to compel the gods by magic, you had to ask them nicely now. That is his theory, and it's been a very influential one. I think for various reasons, no, it's not quite that simple. I mean, he was in a height of a rational, that book was originally published in 1890, and that was kind of the height of rationalism and reductionism. In some ways worse than it is now. But you could say that petitionary prayer is asking God for something. Working with the power of intention of the will is trying to make something happen. Obviously, plenty of people have tried both, and whatever works, as long as you can keep from doing too much damage to yourself or anybody else, probably okay.
The, different rituals and things is more empowering to that intention? Do you think that's what I'm wondering. What, does it add something, or is the power of intention as powerful?
I would say it's a matter of, in some ways it's just simply a matter of taste. Magic can be done in a lot of ways, from the very, very simple to the very, very complex and arcane. As long as you kind of keep to the principles, and focusing intention is kind of one of those. The basic differences I don't think are that great. And as I say, as a matter of personal taste. I really love dressing up in these blue robes associated with the Sphera Hesed and the planet Jupiter and all kinds of stuff. I think this is really cool, or this is neat. So you do that. Someone else says, I feel ridiculous in this stuff. And they're not going to do that. It's not going to work for them. In a way, it is, the answer I would say is a rather pragmatic one.
it sounds like there is not much chance for magic to go right. So what would be the real benefit of it? That's the first one. The second one, do some people have a natural ability for magic?
I would say yes. People do have some ability for it. And maybe that's the answer to the first question as well. There's some people who are going to be better at it. There are people with a knack for it. Some people claim to have it handed down in families. Some people have psychic powers without ever having asked for it. I knew a woman who had the power of psychokinesis. And one evening at my house, she was rather bored, and there was a lit candle on the mantelpiece. And part of this wick, it was very weird. Part of the wick, the lit wick, detached itself and started making its way down the candle in a kind of serpentine pattern. I had no idea what to make of this. And later my girlfriend said, well, I saw Vlad and Natasha giggling, and I think they may have had something to do with it. And Natasha, of course, she's Russian. What else would she be? She reminds me greatly of Madame Blavatsky, and I think, that's enough. I don't know. She's a good friend of mine.
The conversation you were having before the two questions somewhat conjured up into my mind Jung's theory of synchronicity. Could you comment a little bit about that?
Yeah. It's complicated. For one thing, he didn't define it exactly honestly, because he defined it, that's the subtitle of his book, an acausal connecting principle. That is, two events happen that are very similar, that one does not seem to cause the other. But that's not really what he's saying. He's saying that there is a hidden cause, an occult cause in the psyche, in the collective unconscious that's causing both. So it's really not very honest of him to say it's acausal. But again, the principle is the same. Something in the psyche manifests in the physical world in two apparently quite different ways. And the most famous example that Jung himself cited was his patient had a very powerful dream for her involving an Egyptian scarab beetle. And while she was telling him about this in his office, this beetle starts rapping on the trying to get in the window. And he recognized the beetle. It wasn't an Egyptian scarab beetle because this was Switzerland, but it was the closest thing you could get in Switzerland to an Egyptian scarab beetle. So, in his view, that this was a meaningful coincidence, and presumably there would have been some event in the psyche, collective or personal, that somehow triggered this off. So again, but the thing is, and the problem with Jung's stuff is he always had to cling to a scientific framework or persona. I mean, his doctoral dissertation was on the psychic phenomena associated with his cousin. And of course, he didn't describe her as his cousin, this young woman, E.S. or whatever her name was. But he was always fascinated in it. But since this is taboo in scientific circles then and now, he had to muss it up a little bit.
Yeah, like the power intention, you were saying that some magic was used against Trump. Actually, there was also, why it probably didn't work is because there was actually over 1,000 sorcerers actually for Trump, and this is well known on YouTube, that they were using something called mimetic magic. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's a new form of magic, actually. Internet magic, basically, where you're creating basically sigil images. They go into people's minds and subconsciously usually, but also consciously, and using as a meme, like a meme, I don't know if you're familiar with the meme, using that as a form of magic. And if you look up mimetic magic, or meme magic, I'm sorry, It's pretty interesting, and as far as that's why I think actually, and Trump is probably actually aware of this magic, and he's actually it's actually they're using. Have you heard of Kek, the Egyptian frog god, who brings the sun out of the earth every morning?
How do you?
Kek, K-E.
Oh, you mean in the Egyptian myth?
The Egyptian frog god.
Actually, he's also associated with guess what? The scarab beetle.
Not sure. He's a hermaphrodite.
The sun is associated with the scarab beetle in Egyptian. It may also well have been the frog.
It's not very popular. There's some images of Kek as a humanoid with a frog head.
How does it spell? K-A?
K-E-K-A. And
oh yeah, I have seen.
And actually, Trump has symbolically done things that Kek does, and I'm pretty sure he's probably aware of it at this point. And Trump might actually be a sorcerer himself. I don't know if you think of that. But also one other thing.
That I don't know, but I mean, I could well imagine there are plenty of pro-Trump sorcerers working in the other direction, and that's another thing with magic because, hey, you can get into these magical battles. Kek, I've heard about it. I haven't really looked up very much.
Yeah, as far as the Kek is into repeating numbers, and that's actually how you can prove. That's what a lot of occultists believe, that God is when it's all chaos, and then when you find chaotic numbers, and when you find repeating numbers, therefore there's consciousness and God there, and that's actually what Kek does. He does is repeating numbers.
That's interesting.
And as far as 666, 77, Aleister Crowley, use 777, and is there what do you thought of repeating numbers like 33? If there's any significance of 33, or what you thought of that?
Well, basically. And this is something that nobody really knows very much about, period. But we all know a very basic fact, which is that the mind structures reality. We do not see what's out there, whatever that is. We see it within the realm of certain mental structures. The person who figured this out and became considered one of the world's great philosophers because of it was Immanuel Kant. This is what he's saying in his rather rotund way. So, you're always seeing, you pick out patterns and the mind does it. And it's a little tricky to say, is it out there? Is the mind creating it? This is perhaps not quite relevant, but I was recently looking at the Flower of Life materials by one Drunvalo Melchizedek, a copy of which I bought at none other than the Quest bookshop, which I urge you all to visit frequently, and on and on. But he has this kind of pattern in which the world is allegedly constructed. Now, and if you think about it, like for example, in certain psychedelic experiences, you start to see patterns of this sort. And then you find yourself asking, well, is this the kind of grid work on which the world out there is constructed? Or is this the grid work in my mind that I'm using to construct the world? So I don't think anybody knows the answer to that. I think all sorts of people pretend to know the answer, and I think that is as big a mystery as there is out there.
I have a very different kind of question.
Mm-hmm.
You're obviously a scholar of magic and the occult, and you've struck me as being very open-minded about that. What is your standard of evidence that you use to even realize that there is something like magic? I mean, any real evidence of that, and you'd be a multimillionaire, as you well know. What is your standard of magic to assume that anything is true with respect to all of this?
Well, the principle I use is basically, and one that was kind of taught to me, is in a sense kind of neither accept nor reject. That is to say, particularly with all sorts of magical experiences, all of this thing, I simply have no idea. But the whole skeptical debunking attitude is not as skeptical as it would like to appear, because it is often just assuming that there is this really rather finite construct called physical reality, and that anything that violates this somehow just doesn't exist. And I don't think the evidence for that is very good at all. I think there's just a baskets of evidence. But, you know, to some extent, I suppose it's prejudice. But I have to say that most of the people I've known who dismiss it, you know, are dismissing it as much out of prejudice as anything else.
I have to vehemently disagree. Sorry, I have to vehemently disagree there. I don't know if you've read the rules of, for instance, Amsterdam University or Amsterdam University has this $1 million prize. Harvard has this $1 million prize. Munich University has a $1 million prize. If you read the rules, you don't have to prove that something is physical. You just have to prove that something occult happens, and it is very broad, and nobody's ever been able to do it.
Do you know how high the walls in those esteemed universities are against this kind of thing? Do you know how?
Yes, I do, because
I don't think you do.
I've been part of the committees who evaluate that. Yes, I do know. You can walk in there now. A very good example that you gave early on in your lecture that struck me, that these Chinese masters can knock somebody over with their mental energy. If they can do as much as turn a page, they're multimillionaires. Just do it in controlled circumstances. And that controlled circumstances could be in a Chinese temple. Yeah, it's not like you have to come to a lab in Amsterdam. So, no, I vehemently disagree because I know those rules. And I'm always struck with if anything magical is true, why aren't you a multimillionaire? Your friend who can do telekinesis. Walk in, do the trick with the candle, walk out a multimillionaire. Why doesn't that happen? Or tell them, come to my house, come to your house, and see the same thing there.
Well, the people I know who are multimillionaires don't do it that way, which may either prove or disprove what you're trying to say. I do think there is a fair amount of evidence that these things do happen. Do they happen under? I just named any number of things. But of course, under controlled circumstances, maybe. On the other hand, are controlled circumstances, and you better ask yourself this very seriously, my friend, are your controlled circumstances designed to prevent anything from happening? Oh, by the way, it doesn't work. This is not like science of the conventional sort, Herr Doctor, because in science of the conventional sort, you perform an experiment. You're stuffing lipstick down the throat of the rat until it dies. Well, it took this much lipstick stuffed down the throat of the rat to die as an experiment that I'm sure you know is performed. Well, okay, it takes this number of milligrams per kilograms of body weight to kill a rat with lipstick. Your mood has nothing to do with that. Absolutely nothing. Your mental state as a researcher has nothing to do with that. Zero. When you're dealing with a mind, the mental state of everybody involved is affected. So there's no controlled circumstances in the way that you would like to suppose. That is my answer.
We all understand that we all have emotion and a range of emotion. But in what sort of experiment would you prove that your emotion is the exact same as mine? They may be the same flavor, but they cannot be determined as the same. And I think that in this situation, when the conditions are right and everything aligns, things can happen that we can't control or that we cannot necessarily see or name.
Yeah, I mean, just to add one thing, I mean, you know, there is a lot of parapsychological research that has been done. And a lot of it
has been debunked. There isn't a single one.
No, actually, that's not my understanding. My understanding is that there are statistically significant evidences in favor of all of these things. We're actually talking now about evidence, and you know, your evidence is very likely different from mine. What you've read is very different, or theoretically know is very different from mine, and we're not going to settle that here.